welcome to County Board Wrap-Up. I'm Cara O'Donnell, your host for our monthly deep dive into the important decisions the County Board took at its latest meeting. This month, we're going to take a look at things like new local street types, the Rosslyn Sector Plan, zoning ordinances for signs, and a lot more. Joining us as always, we have County Board Chair Libby Garvey and our special guest this week, Board Member Christian Dorsey. Thank you both of you for joining us.
It's always fun.
Now, we're going to start with in Rosalind, we made some decisions about street types to better accommodate pedestrians and bicycles. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we added a street type, which is actually quite used in Europe quite a bit, and it's basically flat, so that the street is really more for people to walk on. Cars can go there if we have to, like emergency vehicles and that kind of thing. But it's really to encourage people to walk in the city and make it feel comfortable and like it's for you to actually live in. And I think it's really a great move. So we needed to, because we have zoning, rules. It's got to be in our codes. So it's there now.
And what spurred this action?
Well, just simply trying to, one, the whole plan for Rosalind. And it has been assumed that one of the streets, 18th Street particularly, is going to really be a pedestrian street. We had a little talk about what should we call it. I think it's called a pedestrian priority street. Yeah. I liked walking street myself. I kind of thought that was a little simpler. But whatever you call it, it's really going to be a nice, welcoming kind of street for people. And now it's really to make us be able to realize the plan we've got for Rosalind. And other parts, because we're going to be looking at doing it elsewhere as well. Particularly up here in Courthouse, we're working more to make it more easily for people to just walk around. They don't have to be in a car.
Now, once we implement these in Rosalind and Courthouse, is there talk about maybe expanding this to other parts of the county? I know the car-free diet is a really big part of the county's efforts, so to make a little more of this pedestrian, bicycle-friendly streets?
I mean, I think the unique thing is that it works really in the areas of Rosalind and Courthouse for which we're now designating these as possibilities, as desired outcomes. It really works there. It doesn't work everywhere, but in those high-density areas where you want to not encourage people to use cars, and where you want to situate development in such a way that facilitates all manner of people getting around, this is a useful tool for us to have. And the great thing is, we've guided future development by looking at the map, saying, this is where it makes perfect sense. Yeah. We've taken out a lot of the uncertainty for future development, and we kind of have something that we're moving towards. So I think it's a great way that we can stay innovative and ahead of the curve in terms of shaping what our community looks like.
Exactly. And while we're doing that, it really has been done in Europe for quite a while. I mean, when I first heard about it, I said, oh, the Strøget, I think that's what you call it in Danish, in Copenhagen, and that was one of the very first. But really, European cities were made for people because they were made long before we had cars. Right. And I think more and more we realize that those cities are very human scale, and they just make people comfortable to be there, happy to be there, and that's what we want.
That's right.
We'll spend a little time out there on the streets enjoying the community.
And one of the things that we see in Rosalind and Courthouse, one of the deficiencies or criticisms some people have, if you will, they may be good for the 9-to-5 business populations, but not necessarily communities that operate well at all manner of day and night. And this is a new type of tool that can encourage that constant pedestrian activity. And imagine, having a street that's not gridlocked with cars and has open access, what that could do for cafes and outdoor seating. I mean, you can...
Kind of makes like a permanent street festival in a way, which we do elsewhere.
Kind of that outdoor community building type thing. Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Rosslyn Sector Plan there a moment ago, and of course this is all part of that. Let's talk about the larger scale Rosslyn Sector Plan and some of the decisions that were made.
Yeah, well, there were a number on the zoning, and particularly we looked at signs and how we can do different things with signs. It's really interesting. A lot of our regulations here in Arlington, and actually I'm sure most of the country is like this, they were put in place decades ago. And suddenly, so one of the things like we will see, in fact, our colleague John Weistat, remember when he pulled up, at the meeting, we looked at this sign that's got like moving people on it and flashing lights. Nobody even thought about that when we were doing sign regulations. So where does that fit? And too often, because you've got a code and you need to have a structure that, you need to have some control over things, but people come with really cool ideas, and particularly in Rosalind because it's changing so much, and find out, well, it doesn't fit with your regulations. Well, I think we need to do some adapting, and that's what we're working on and moving forward. I mean, we're going to continue to have structure and some control to make people, make sure that we do the right thing, but really allow a lot of innovation, creativity, and I think it'll just continue. Just like the walking street, then you've got really cool things to look at. And that's what's happening around the area, and we're frankly in competition with some really cool happening areas, and we need to keep up.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of community engagement on this process throughout the whole Rosslyn Sector Plan.
We have.
Everybody seems to be kind of rallying around these ideas for the most part.
I think
A little bit about a building height.
Yeah, I mean, the community has come together and they've worked through some issues. I mean, in addition to the flexibility, which is our being responsive to changing market dynamics, which impact places like Rosalind a lot, I think we've also done something that works with the community desire to make sure we just don't get bigger and bigger and bigger without being thoughtful. And one of the great things about the sector plan that we've operationalized now is, we used to have a policy that just says we're going to taper down our big buildings as they get closer to residential neighborhoods.
Didn't work on a hill.
Didn't really work. The tapering didn't really work. So we've
Not
come
for
up.
Rosalind. It works elsewhere. It does,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've created some new zoning tools and operationalized the philosophy that kind of the community came up with, that we were going to have peaks and valleys in Rosalind while protecting some view sheds so that we maintain the ability for people to actually see into Washington, and also protected neighborhoods from just denser and denser development, and created some variety in the Rosalind skyline, not just for aesthetics, but recognizing that that's how you create development potential on certain parcels, but others are not going to just get bigger and fatter. So it's really a way to make sure the vision can become reality.
Right, and the Rosalind, I mean, one of the key areas is the view, and we call it view sheds.
Yeah.
We call that, and one of our marketing sort of taglines that we talk about when we're out talking to the rest of the world, frankly, about why you want to come here. The best views of Washington D.C. are
Capital
from right
views.
here in Arlington County.
Now, what's the time frame for some of these projects, specifically for Rosalind? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years,
Long
longer?
time. And longer. And
Okay,
longer.
and
Yeah,
longer.
yeah. Because it's, I mean, some of the, for example, the one we did before, we had which we talked about 4 different phases. Last one might be in 2040. I mean, and a lot of it depends on market conditions and what happens. But basically, we've got the framework there, when it will be totally realized, if you will. I mean, it really could be, 40 years or more. But now we've got a plan to work within, and it's got some flexibility. So as times change and building techniques get different and things get different, we've got some flexibility to allow that.
But all this emphasis on planning does accelerate when development could happen. Because just imagine a world where you didn't have these plans and you're kind of looking at
Inventing
things
the
parcel
wheel.
by parcel.
Oh, yeah.
It's really creating sort of planning processes each and every time someone has an idea. Now we have a blueprint that people can really work towards and fine tune. And even though the sector plan, before it looks like what we envision now, that'll be decades down the road, you're already seeing some things which are reflective of that vision. The Central Place complex,
Yes,
which
it's
is going to
really
be 2
exciting.
buildings and
That
new
was,
plaza.
that was where we needed to do the signage.
That's
'cause
right.
It was a totally different kind of area, and our the usual regulations weren't working for that, and we needed to make some adjustments. So.
And some of that long-term planning, that same kind of things are happening along Columbia Pike, correct?
That's right. Well, we've had a plan for Columbia Pike for the past decade or so.
Yeah, form-based code.
To encourage
Neighborhoods
redevelopment,
plan, yep.
make it easier. But that wasn't just a set it and forget it. It needs tinkering over time to make sure you're being responsive to changing conditions. And we have a process there where we're constantly looking at the code to figure out what can be tweaked in order to encourage development, but at the same time, not create a homogeneous Columbia Pike. Because one of the things everybody recognizes is that it's great to have diversity not only in parts of the county in terms of what things look like, but even along certain areas and along certain blocks.
Yeah, and we have that great, the world in a zip code, you say about Columbia Pike. That's your hood and actually mine
That's
too,
right.
and it's what we all love about it. So we want to keep it interesting.
That's right.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break now, and when we return, we'll chat a little more about those signs of the times and much more when we return on County Board Wrap. Welcome back to County Board Wrap-Up, our monthly chat discussing the recent important actions taken by the board that help shape Arlington and contribute to our quality of life. Back with us are Board Chair Libby Garvey and Board Member Christian Dorsey. Thank you both once again. And we talked about this a little bit in the last segment about the new sign ordinances and regulations.
Yeah.
This kind of has an interesting history to it. So let's
It's
talk
got
a little bit about
long
this.
and complex
A
history,
long,
actually, and I
drawn-out
don't even
history.
know it all. You know, when I first got on the board, we were looking at lighted signs and the issue of lighted signs. And I think, you know, Arlington in many ways is kind of, it used to be a sleepy southern town, you know, and I think people consider, we were like a bedroom community. We didn't have, and we're turning into a real happening place with tall buildings and lit signs and, you know, there's a transition and it can be a little uncomfortable. So that was sort of my first introduction actually to board work, was talking about signs. Yeah. And now this one, there's sort of an interesting, again, that just sort of shows what we're up against. I think I talked in the earlier segment about how old, I mean, we've had regulations on the books for a long time, and then things change. So, and when you try to update, you can forget things sometimes. So what we found was that we had updated the sign regulations, and
that was back
working
in 2012.
yeah, and
right?
that was working well for people, except we forgot to put in something that if you already have a sign and you want to get to the new kind of sign, you couldn't do it. So we had to go back, and that just didn't make any sense at all. But you got to make it legal, you know, for people to do. So that is kind of one of the many, you know, local government is always interesting.
Yeah.
And it really is, it's just so clear how much we're in a transition. And as we move forward, I mean, you just got to understand there are going to be things that, you know, it's so complicated. You know, and Debbie Alpert does a great job. But every now and then we'll miss things or we won't have thought of something. So there we go. Part of the reason we have a lot of public engagement, because that helps us keep from missing stuff.
Absolutely. And, you know, our sign ordinances have gone through lots of iterations and evolution. You know, the county board used to approve sign plans, not a great idea. But then when you make it an administrative action, you've really got to figure out what are the rules that you want people to operate under. And as Ms. Garvey said, it's difficult to figure out how to create a box that's reflective of changing technologies and circumstances. So we're going to be looking at that throughout the entire county and in lots of different ways, because, you know, signage is extremely important, not just for the success of businesses, but for creating placemaking, for giving people a way to navigate without causing hazards, whether they're walking or driving.
We had a lot of time about those high signs and whether we should have them, and I said, that's how I find places.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, even me, I've lived here since 1977, and I still get, well, for one, there are new buildings going up.
Right, all the time.
And it's really helpful to look up and say, oh, that's where I'm going.
But at the same time, you don't want to create an atmosphere where everything goes. Then you have billboards,
Right.
and then you have
Right.
you know, signs that create
Or
hazards.
people's bedrooms
So-
with lights flashing.
Flashing
And we
into
can't,
them,
we
which
don't
we
want
don't want.
We don't want
Right.
to.
Yeah.
But and it's always just kind of an ever-changing story. I mean, they say the only thing constant is change.
Yes.
That's
So
absolutely right.
this is something we'll obviously keep looking at on an ongoing basis
Yeah.
and change as we need to.
That's
Yeah,
right.
That's exactly
That's
right.
right.
I mean, just one more point on signs is what I've realized just recently talking about is signage has kind of become art. It's like public art, you
Yeah.
know? And you look at things that's really cool and you don't even quite realize it's a sign, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
That whole brand identity issue.
yeah.
Yes.
Remember the
Yes.
big bus stop with a big bus and they had people like, that was the bus stop,
Oh,
but it had a
sure.
huge, and
Yeah.
people could like take shelter in the sign that
That's
said bus.
right.
I mean, it's just cool.
Very creative.
Yeah.
But speaking of changes, you know, we touched on this last month with the issue of short-term residential rentals.
Right, right.
And we're getting a process in place. And I
Yeah.
think
We
that's the
are.
important thing, is getting that public engagement, that community input
Right.
on where we proceed. So
Right.
what was the action that was taken?
Well, we call it advertising.
Yes.
So basically, it's putting it out there. There's actually a whole legal process to go through, and it's called advertising. So it actually, you know, in the old days, and I think we still do post it in the newspapers.
Yeah.
You know, we're required to do that. But
Have to
most
do.
people have to do, because some things have been around for a long time. It's fine.
Tradition.
But also, we've got it, you know, online. Everything. We have a whole page up there on the, you know, on our website. People can go to it and probably type in, you know, short-term rentals. And we would love to get input from folks. And that's really where we are now. So we're advertising it just to let people comment on it and know it's out there. We'll be adopting it in December, actually. We're going to go
That's right.
through November. So we've got a good spate of time.
So yeah, this is a good time for people to really let us know, electronic media, electronic comments, well before the public hearing,
Right.
where they can respond to the zoning ordinance proposal that we've put out there.
Right.
And it goes through how we intend to regulate Airbnbs and other short-term rentals. And
Craigslist.
yeah, it applies to many platforms.
There's a lot of different things, and there'll probably be more before we even finish.
Right.
It all, right? Yeah.
But this is really our chance to really get a sense of how these regulations would affect the community, and to see what our community can tell us back, so that we can perfect a zoning ordinance that makes a lot of sense. And it's intentionally broad, kind of what we put out there. We could do a range of things, and we did that by design.
Right, because when we vote on it, you can tighten it, but you can't open it up anymore.
So it'll be interesting to see how this plays
Yeah,
out.
no, and we really want, and just one more thing, because it's the sharing economy, which is totally new. And it used to be you had businesses, and you'd regulate businesses, and then you had private people doing private things, and we didn't regulate that because that's private lives. And suddenly there's this intersection, and we really, if we don't have help from our public, we're going to miss stuff, and we really don't want to do that. So, and you had talked about all the electronic ways to contact us. We absolutely want that, but you can see us in a coffee shop or in the grocery store. Pull us over and talk to us, which happens all the time too.
One-on-one's always good too. So,
Whatever.
all right. Well, thank you very much. This seems like a very good point to take another short break. But when we return, hard to believe, but it is budget time once again. We're going to talk about that. Welcome back to our final segment of County Board Wrap-Up with Board Chair Libby Garvey and this month's special guest, Board Member Christian Dorsey. And now it's time for an old favorite. I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's actually already budget time. Now, I'm not crazy when I say this is a little earlier than usual, right? Okay.
No, you're not. But actually, the budget is one of the most important things we do. I think right up out there after hiring the manager. This is what we do. What we have is at the end of every budget year, we have something called carryover.
Yes.
There's some leftover money. Now, people can get upset about this. It's a fair amount of money. It's actually, this year, it's about 1% of our budget. And if you think about your own budget in your own home, you don't want to get to the end of the year and have it absolutely tight, because if something goes wrong with a car or whatever, you're in big trouble. So you need to have just a little bit of cushion. When we have that at the end of the year, so you always want to have that, then we decide what to do with it. Now, in the past, the manager has come and made recommendations and the board has voted on it, all in one meeting. And this year, talked to the manager and my colleagues, and we decided we'd do it a little differently and get a little more public engagement, because really this is, if you just sort of do it without talking to people, it kind of feels like off-budget spending in a way, because you haven't really discussed it. So we've got a chance to discuss it now. So the manager presented his recommendations, and we're going to be adopting that next month. And again, this is something we'd be happy to hear from folks on, what they'd like to have us use that money for. And a certain amount of it is just getting carried forward, so it'll be folded into the next budget process.
Yeah,
is there a process at all about getting priorities for some of this carryover fund, or is there, with certain initiatives, or how does that work? Or are we really looking for that input?
We're looking for that, but the manager actually explained his priorities, which sort of made sense, which there are some things that we know we're going to need to spend money on that we hadn't expected that come up, and so one-time spending, that makes sense. So some of the money that he's saying, so for land purchase for one, so that seems to make sense. So there's explanations for each spending, and most of what's left goes forward into the next budget, and that'll go through the whole cycle.
Yeah, and so what we found out are two things. One, 2016, the fiscal year, was a good year for Arlington. As Ms. Garvey said, we forecasted revenues, and we got revenues in 1% over that number. You always want to be over, and you never want to be too much over.
And actually, it's a combination. I will just add a little bit. It's a combination of, and also certain departments not spending quite as much.
That's right.
And you want to encourage departments to have efficiencies.
That's
so
right.
If you don't need it, you don't spend it.
And that's always necessary, because in the case of our Department of Environmental Services, there was that whole snowstorm that they could not have foreseen.
That little blizzard we had.
That's right.
Which was $5 million.
$5 million.
That we hadn't planned on.
So that left that department, that one department, with a $2.5 million overage. So if if you're at the point where you forecast revenues and it's so tight, you're not going to have the room really to think about accommodating those
Snowstorms.
unanticipated
That we
events.
can't ever control.
Windstorms. I mean, there's just, well, we can't anticipate because we don't know what it is. So
That's right.
We don't know what we don't know.
So as part of what the manager has recommended is to create or to augment a fund that already exists for regional downturns and circumstances that we can't foresee, to actually incorporate weather events as a justification or a reason that we can actually expend those funds while adding a little bit more to it based on our current year experience. So it's really about closing out the fiscal year and knowing that, there are certain things that happen during the course of the year that we're committed to in the future, and we need to make sure that those funds are available. So we had a lot of talk about fire stations this year, right?
We did, just
Right?
a little bit.
Right?
Just a little
So
bit.
solving those issues costs money. And
Yes,
we
it
now
does.
have the room
Have the
through that
resources to
closeout
do
to
that.
do
We've
it.
got the resources to do it. And this might not be a bad time to talk just a little bit about reserves and the role that reserves play, because people will look at our budget. In fact, when I first got on the board, there's a fair amount of money in reserves. Well, we have this thing called a bond rating, which I think most of our listeners will be familiar with. And to keep that AAA bond rating, they're bond rating agencies we meet with every year in New York. As long as we've got this AAA bond rating, that means that then we can put out bonds for roads, schools, everything at the lowest possible rate. So we actually save money on that. But in order to maintain that, we have to have a certain amount of reserves. And for a while, our reserves were just 2.5% of our total budget. And they said,
Not enough.
Not enough. So now it's at 5. Some places it's 10, 20, it's a whole lot more. People can think about it a little bit as a, they always say in your own personal budget, you ought to have enough money, cash on hand, to get by like 6 months. Without, if something happens, you get
The
sick.
proverbial rainy day fund.
That's
Yes,
right.
the proverbial rainy day fund. And then as Christian was mentioning about the snow, the manager is starting what he's calling a snowy day fund. And we're going to be talking about how much should go in there, because I think, with climate change, these big snowstorms are going to be coming on a lot more frequently. It may be getting warmer, but when we get storms, they're big.
They're severe.
And I think Arlington has fought very much to make sure that we can keep adequate reserves, but not unnecessarily high. So we've actually worked to educate the bond rating agencies to understand how our diverse economy, where we have lots of different revenue sources that have proven to be stable over time, we don't need to sock away any more taxpayer cash than we need to. We do what is required, but we don't do more than that, because that's something where we're delivering value for tax money as opposed to unnecessarily buttressing up reserves. Some communities need to do that, but Arlington fortunately is in a place where we can keep reserves high enough to satisfy them, but low enough to not have our money actually working on doing the good investments in the community that we need.
And it's a balance, and we're really always thinking of the taxpayers, which actually probably feeds into our next topic, because we did 2 things on the budget.
Well, that's what I was just going to get to. Is something that's obviously going to affect a lot of people, especially commuters, is this discussion of 395 and the part where we may be talking a new HOV lane and some changes there. Now, there are a lot of misperceptions. Since this takes place in Arlington County, you have some input, but that's not the whole picture. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the major point here is control. We don't have it. We really don't have it. So, but we are working well. I think the folks in VDOT are they're working very closely with us. We are asking for, if you watch the meeting that we just had, and we had a long presentation from them about particularly 395. They're going to come back again later and do 66. But we were talking about, so they do modeling. One of the things they do is they've got changes they're going to make, and they model, and what's the effect going to be on the road. And also, we push to make sure, let's talk about the side streets too, because we want to know what's happening, not just on 395, Arlington. And they do not yet have that information out. And I made clear that we really want to see that information, that modeling information, so we know what the effect is going to be. We're going to be asked to approve a resolution that's supportive, but it really has no power there. And that was sort of covered, and I said, yeah, that's right. So I'm not, even if it doesn't really have an effect, I'm not approving a resolution until I know what it's actually going to mean for Arlington. So we're looking for that. And then there's the whole issue of sound walls.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue, because, it's, as they think about what they're doing with 395, it's not that they're adding any
Space.
meaningful
They're staying
capacity.
within the roadbed,
They're staying within the existing right-of-way, but just adding a travel lane by reconfiguring the middle HOV section currently, taking away a shoulder to create one, and getting another travel lane. It's going to have a real marginal increase in noise that comes from the highway. But whenever you do a project like this, there are federal regulations that govern that say you go to the community that would be affected, and there's a way of modeling and determining who falls into that category.
And how much noise it's going to be.
That's right.
Yep, whole bit.
And asking them, hey, do you want us to mitigate this with a sound wall? And while that sounds in isolation, like, oh, sure, if you're going to create more noise, give me a sound wall, that doesn't come without cost. And we're looking at what we're going to give up. Would a sound wall require that we lose some historic resources? Would we lose some natural resources?
Trees.
What's the impact of that? And is that worth the marginal benefit that you get from a sound wall? So, our community has to grapple with, if you're not concerned about sound from the highway now, what's being done is not really going to add to it. But sound walls in certain places could dramatically affect ecosystems and what we have.
And there are people who are concerned about the noise now and would really like those sound walls.
Right.
And then the thing, so I said we had no control, and we don't have control of the sound walls either, but who does are the people who live along, because they get to vote. And so we may end up at times where the people who are right next to the highway, they'd really like that sound wall, even if it means cutting down trees and bushes or going over some historic land. People who live a little farther out, they like those trees. They like to see them in the horizon, and the noise doesn't bother them so much because they're far away. They don't want the sound wall. But at some point, they may not get to vote. The only people who get to vote are the ones who are most impacted. There's a sense of justice there, but we on the board have absolutely no say.
Yeah.
So this will be kind of an ongoing process. What's the best way? I know there have been public meetings already. There'll be more.
Meetings.
What's the best way for folks to stay informed on this one?
Well, they should go to VDOT's Transform 95 project website. It's a pretty robust and substantial website.
I'm sure just Googling on it, you'll pop up the website.
That's right. And they provide lots of forms for public engagement. But even within our community, there are lots of exhibits and visuals, and also ways to comment if you're able to access this building, 2100 Clarendon Boulevard, as well as Central Library. There are ongoing exhibits that document this project and provide a way for people to engage.
Plus, if you're close to the road, you're going to get a mailing. You're going to get a ballot mailed to you to vote.
Yeah.
And if people don't respond, they'll probably send another ballot. And I think we're going to probably try to make sure that everybody is really aware. You're getting this ballot. Please vote. Let us know what you think, because we don't want to have a sound wall go up because 5 people decided to vote, and 3 of them decided they wanted the wall, and 2 didn't, and there were another 200 who just didn't vote. So we want to make sure everybody votes on that, which is huge. So
All
we'll
right.
see.
Great. Well, there's a lot of important issues, and obviously things we will not be finished talking about anytime
No, and I'd like to
soon.
bring up one last thing, just because we'd like to get some input, and that is our direction to the manager on the budget.
The 2018 budget.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, we're working ahead already, and that too is something else that in the past that was usually the board present, because this is board direction to the manager. The board chair would present it at a meeting, and we'd vote and be done. And I really thought that the public ought to be able to comment on this as well. So I presented something at our last meeting, and we're going to be voting on it in November. And again, we'd love to hear from folks about what they think.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. And that takes us to the end of another edition of County Board Wrap-Up. Thank you again to Libby and Christian. And we hope you enjoyed this discussion of the important issues faced by the board on behalf of the Arlington community. Join us again next month for another conversation with County Board Chair Libby Garvey and possibly another guest member. Thanks for being with us. To learn more about the issues discussed today, plus county services, programs, and initiatives, visit arlingtonva.us. And please let us hear from you on Twitter, Facebook, and Nextdoor. We want to hear your views on these topics and other issues going on around the county. We'll see you again next month.
Thanks, Christian.
Wonderful.